Good evening. My name is Joe, and tonight I want to share the story of a friend of mine, a story that reached me at a time when I needed to believe that life could start over, even for people who felt they had already gone too far down the wrong road. I won't tell you exactly what was happening in my own life back then. Maybe one day I will, but for now it's enough to say that the nights felt longer than they should. The house didn't sound the way it used to, and I had begun to wonder if the life I was living was really the one I was meant to carry all the way to the end. When this friend sat down in front of me, wrapped his hands around a cup of coffee, and told me what he did when he realized he was disappearing inside his own days, something in me woke up. His courage wasn't neat or perfect, but it was real, and it gave me a quiet kind of hope I hadn't felt in years. I won't use his real name. Tonight, we'll call him Daniel. Daniel was 38 when his old life cracked. From the outside, he looked like the kind of man people point to and say, he's doing well. He'd been with the same company since his early 20s, loyal and predictable, the man bosses trusted when things got messy. Promotions came slowly but steadily. His parents were proud. He and his wife, Laura, had a neat little house, 2 decent cars, a remodeled kitchen, and vacation photos that looked like advertisements for a life well lived. But inside that picture was a man who had quietly traded almost everything he loved for one word: provider. He had watched his father come home late but reliable, and somewhere along the line decided that love meant carrying every burden without complaint. So when he married, he did exactly that. Overtime became normal. Answering emails at the table became normal. Missing dinners, birthdays, weekends, all in the name of taking care of us, became normal. Every time Laura mentioned something she wanted, a nicer vacation, a better car, a new project for the house, Daniel answered not with a conversation, but with more work. He thought he was building a safe life. He didn't notice that he was slowly disappearing from the one he had. The first crack appeared in a small, ordinary moment. One evening, Laura left her laptop open on the dining table. As Daniel walked past, a message popped up in the corner of the screen. He hadn't meant to look. His eyes just landed on it. The words were simple, but they didn't belong between a married woman and another man. A pet name he had never heard. A hint about meeting somewhere. That easy, playful tone that lives in the space between 2 people who know they're keeping a secret. His chest went cold. His first instinct wasn't anger. It was blame, aimed straight at himself. If I had come home earlier, if I had put my phone down, if I had been more present, if I had been enough. That night they fought, then cried, then talked, until their voices were thin. Laura said she was lonely, that she felt like she lived with his calendar, not with him. She said she missed the man who used to look at her like she was the center of the room. She promised it hadn't gone too far, that it was a stupid mistake. Daniel believed her. It was easier to believe that he had failed than to consider that she had chosen to step outside their vows. He forgave her, or tried to, and he made promises of his own. He started coming home earlier. He silenced his phone at dinner. He booked a weekend away and left his laptop behind. For a while things looked better. They laughed more. They took new photos. But underneath the surface, something stayed fragile, like a cracked glass that still holds water but trembles every time you set it down. Months later, the second crack didn't hide. It showed up in late nights that didn't match the story, in strange charges on a shared bank account, in a hotel reservation under her name that had no reasonable explanation left. When he confronted her, there were fewer tears and more careful phrases. A different man, the same story about loneliness, needs, feeling unseen. Only this time, something inside Daniel refused to take all the blame. Yes, he had been absent. Yes, He had hidden in his work, but she had chosen secrets. She had chosen lies. He realized he'd been loyal to a version of her that had stopped showing up years ago. Still, leaving a life you've built is not as simple as slamming a door. He stayed a little longer, as many people do. He stayed for shared bills, shared friends, shared holidays. He stayed because he didn't want to be the divorced one at family gatherings. He stayed until one night, after another argument that circled the same tired ground and went nowhere, he caught his own reflection in the bathroom mirror. The man looking back at him had tired eyes and a mouth that only smiled in photos. His shoulders slumped as if he were always bracing for impact, and a thought rose up, calm and terrifying. If I don't leave now, this is going to be my whole life. Not a phase, not a rough year, the whole story. That thought was scarier than divorce. A few weeks later, with hands that shook when he held the pen, Daniel filed for divorce. There were no fireworks, just lawyers, signatures, and the quiet work of dividing a shared existence into two piles, yours and mine. He moved into a small apartment with beige walls and a view of a parking lot, half his clothes hanging in a closet that didn't smell like home. Some nights he lay awake and wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. He had done the brave thing people admire from a distance, but bravery doesn't tell you what to do on a Tuesday night when it's just you and your thoughts. He worried about starting over at almost 40, wondered if he was now damaged goods, went back and forth between anger and guilt. Grief almost never moves in a straight line. It jumps. One Friday, trying to quiet his mind with meaningless scrolling, he came across a photograph that froze him in place. A man on a Harley Davidson, riding down a long highway at sunset, the sky wide and orange above an empty road. The caption read, "Sometimes you have to lose the life you plan to find the life that fits." He didn't want the man's jacket or his sunglasses. He wanted that feeling of movement, of direction, of not being stuck in the same 3 rooms thinking the same 3 thoughts. A few days later, almost daring himself, he walked into a Harley dealership just to look. He wasn't the stereotype, no leather, no loud voice, just a man in office clothes with a new habit of touching his bare ring finger. The bikes sat lined up like sleeping animals, polished and waiting. When he sat on a dark touring model, he felt its weight and imagined a road stretching far beyond the edges of his current life. The salesman talked about comfort, long rides, famous routes, Route 66, Chicago to Santa Monica, people who left for a few weeks and came back with the same face but different eyes. Daniel left with a brochure and a new kind of restlessness he couldn't quite explain away. Then came the choice most people only dream about in traffic and never act on. The idea wouldn't leave him alone. Every time he looked at the brochure, that same bathroom mirror thought came back. If I don't change something now, this is going to be my whole life. So he made a plan. He found a new job that would let him start later in the year. He dipped into his savings, bought the Harley, and mapped out a route along old Route 66, from Chicago all the way to the Pacific. He packed light, a few changes of clothes, a small toolkit, a basic first aid kit, a journal, and one promise to himself: do not rush. On the morning he left, he locked the door of his beige apartment, slid the key into his pocket, and walked down to the parking lot. The bike waited in the early light. He strapped his bags down, put on his helmet, and sat there for a moment with the engine still silent, feeling his heart beat in his throat. Then he turned the key, felt the rumble beneath him, and whispered, "Let's find out." And he rode away. The rhythm of the road took over faster than he expected. The city thinned out behind him, replaced by fields, small towns, and long lines of sky. Time stopped being measured in meetings and emails, and started being measured in miles, fuel stops, and sunsets. With his phone zipped away, the noise in his head slowly began to fade. In a diner in Illinois that looked like it had been frozen in the 1950s, he sat at the counter with coffee and pie. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a kind smile, nodded at his helmet and asked where he was headed. When he told her, she raised an eyebrow and said, "Big trip. Running from something or towards something." He thought for a moment and said, "I honestly don't know." She topped off his coffee and replied, "Either way, don't forget to look around. Most people miss their whole life because they're always focused on the next stop." Later that night, in a cheap motel room with thin walls and a humming air conditioner, he wrote that sentence in his journal and underlined it. The days that followed weren't perfect or cinematic. Some were long, hot, and dull, just endless stretches of road and the ache in his shoulders. Some were surprisingly gentle, soft mornings, friendly strangers at gas stations, small towns where people still waved at passing bikes. His memories didn't vanish, they rode along with him. Sometimes the past sat heavy on the back of the bike. The first message, the second betrayal, the sound of his own voice, trying to hold together something that was already gone. But the road gave him something he hadn't had in years. Space. Space to feel the anger he had swallowed to keep the peace. Space to admit that he had done his best, and it still hadn't been enough for someone who didn't want to stay. Space to ask, maybe for the first time in his adult life, what do I want my days to feel like? One night in New Mexico, sitting on a plastic chair outside a small motel, under a sky full of stars, he opened his journal and wrote, "I spent years trying to be enough for someone else, and completely forgot how to be enough for myself." For the first time, he didn't cry when he wrote something like that. He just felt honest. By the time Daniel reached the Pacific, standing on the pier in Santa Monica with the wind tugging at his jacket and the smell of salt in the air, nothing on the outside had magically fixed itself. His divorce was still real. His past choices were still his. The future was no more guaranteed than it had ever been. But inside, the ground had shifted. He realized the journey had never been about erasing Laura or punishing himself. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about remembering that his life was his to live, not a project to manage for someone else's satisfaction. On the ride back, shorter, more direct, less about escaping and more about returning, he felt a quiet steadiness he hadn't known in years. The road hadn't solved his problems. It had simply been loud and quiet in just the right ways, for long enough that he could finally hear what had been true all along. He was allowed to choose himself, too. When he settled into a new routine, it looked smaller from the outside and far richer from the inside. He took a job that paid enough but didn't consume his nights and weekends. He furnished his apartment slowly, choosing things he actually liked instead of things that looked impressive. He kept the Harley, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a reminder that he knew how to leave when staying stopped making sense. He started cooking simple meals for himself, taking rides on weekends just because the weather was kind, and reconnecting with people he had drifted away from when work ruled everything. Day by day, he treated his own time and attention as something valuable. Little by little, he forgave himself, not for leaving, but for the years he had abandoned himself under the excuse of being a good man and a good provider. When he told me all this, sitting across from me with his hands wrapped around a mug, he didn't look like a man who had lost everything. He looked like someone who had finally put something heavy down. And as I listened, I felt something loosen in my own chest, because I knew the feeling of living in a house that looked fine and felt wrong. His story didn't hand me a clear map. It did something better. It reminded me that endings, as painful as they are, can be the doorway to a life that finally fits the person you've become. So tonight, if you hear echoes of your own life in Daniel's story, if you're the one who always says yes, the one who works until you're empty, the one who forgives and forgives while slowly disappearing, or the one staring into a mirror, wondering when your life stopped feeling like your own, I'm not going to tell you to buy a motorcycle and cross a continent. That's his road, not yours. Your road might look like something smaller and quieter, a conversation you've been avoiding, a boundary you need to set, a visit to a therapist, a walk without your phone, a decision to close the laptop when your workday is actually over. What matters is not how dramatic the action looks from the outside, but whether it shifts you, even a little, toward a life where you are present in your own days. My friend once thought his story ended in a lawyer's office, with a pen in his hand and a promise breaking on paper. What he learned, out there on that long strip of asphalt and sky, is that sometimes the moment you feel like you've lost everything is actually the moment you finally put down what was never yours to carry alone. The guilt, the constant performing, the idea that your worth only exists in what you provide. When he turned the key on that Harley and rolled out of that parking lot, he wasn't running away from his life. He was riding toward it, toward the version of himself who could stand alone, breathe deeply, and say, I am here, and that is enough. That's the part of his story that stayed with me, especially on nights when my own house felt too quiet, and my own heart felt too tired. Thank you for staying with me tonight, wherever you are, driving through the dark, standing at a sink full of dishes, lying in a bed that feels too big, or sitting alone in a small place that doesn't quite feel like home yet. I hope you can find one small way to be present for yourself. One small choice that turns the handlebars of your life a few degrees toward what you actually need. You don't have to ride thousands of miles to begin again. Sometimes, starting over is as simple as whispering, this cannot be my whole life, and then taking one honest step in a different direction. Take care of yourself. Rest if you can. And remember, your story is not finished yet.